This section will describe mesh convergence times and scenarios, the reliability of mesh selection, and preventing mesh loops. So what is the process for choosing the best mesh AP? Mesh chooses an uplink between two possible uplinks. One is through a wired Ethernet uplink through eMAPS or backhaul over Ethernet, and the other is through a wireless uplink. These are done in parallel. Let's start when the AP first puts up its link. When an AP first puts up its link, it checks the Ethernet link to see if it can find a link to the controller or gateway. If it can find a link to the controller, that means that it is either a wrap or an eMAP. If it cannot find the gateway or controller on the Ethernet link, that means it can't be a wrap or eMAP, but it can possibly be a map. Let's look at how an AP establishes itself as a root access point. An AP that becomes a wrap first detects that a gateway or controller is on its Ethernet link, and it listens for a little longer to see if there is any map on the Ethernet sending out e-beacons. If there are no e-beacons, then it concludes the following. 1, that it can connect to the gateway or controller directly, and 2, that there is no other eMAP doing forwarding, so the AP concludes that it's a wrap. How does an AP become an eMAP? If the AP is able to find the root access point, but it's also seeing e-beacons coming from another map, it can conclude that it is able to reach the gateway through a map, and therefore it will conclude that it is an eMAP AP. Let's look at how an AP becomes a mesh AP or map. If the AP puts up its link and doesn't find a gateway or controller directly on its Ethernet port, it will start using its wireless uplink to scan to see if there are any other maps in the area that are using the same SSID that it is using and the same mesh key. Then it builds a mesh table and picks the link that has the strongest signal and connects to it. After that, it will use the uplink to connect back to the controller, and then it becomes a mesh AP. The process for mesh APs choosing uplinks is based on a throughput metric, and there are different ways to obtain this metric. Essentially, we're estimating the throughput from the AP itself. Let's say that I have two uplinks to choose from, A or B. What I'm trying to do as a map is trying to find among two possible uplinks which one will give me a higher throughput to and through the core network. A might have a stronger signal strength than B to me. However, if A has to go through a few more hops to get to the core, then the actual throughput is lower than if I were to go through B, which has a weaker signal. So when we do the mesh calculations, what we're trying to do is take into account using the signal strength to convert it into a per hop throughput, and then try to piece together all these per hop throughputs into an end-to-end throughput from me to my neighbor to the core. By comparing the throughput I would get through each of my neighbors, I can then decide which neighbor is giving me a better throughput all the way to the core, not necessarily just from one hop throughput. Let's talk about mesh convergence times and scenarios. One scenario is if you lose your gateway or controller. If you lose your controller or gateway, your typical AP can detect that within about 30 seconds. Once that happens, the AP converts itself into a map and starts scanning, and that takes about another 10 seconds. So we'll say it will be 40 seconds to a minute or so, and then you should be converted from a wrap to a map and connected again through another map, assuming there is another map available for you to uplink to. The other possibility is that you are just moving from one uplink to a better uplink. In that case, the disruption is on the order of seconds because you are literally disconnecting from one uplink and you already know the other one. So you connect to the other one and you do a key exchange, and that takes a few seconds to switch over. What is the typical time for mesh selection? Typically, if you're just switching from one existing uplink that hasn't failed to another uplink, it should take on the order of a few seconds. If you're losing a controller or gateway, let's say you are connected as a wrap and you lose your controller or gateway, that process will take about 30 to 60 seconds. If you're losing the wireless uplink, that takes less time, maybe 10 to 20 seconds to reconnect. Is mesh reliable enough for voice backhaul? There are examples where we use a multi-hop mesh solution to carry traffic, which is typically voice traffic, and they work pretty well. The typical feedback that we get from our customers that if your delays are usually less than 10 to 20 milliseconds, and the network has been continuously running for a day or two without trouble, it will be reliable enough for voice backhaul. How does Mesh identify and prevent loops? In Mesh, we try very hard to prevent loops, but to a certain extent, we have to detect them and break the loops even after they form. So typically what we do is send out packets on the Ethernet and the wireless link at the same time to see if we get a response. We use two different MAC addresses to prevent confusing the switch. We send a packet to ping the gateway from the Ethernet, and we do the same thing through the wireless uplink. If we get a response back, let's say we're not expecting a response from the Ethernet, but we are getting a response from the Ethernet link, that means that someone else somewhere closed a bridge, and that is causing the looping. In that case, we immediately break the loop with the bridge, and we wait for a while and then decide which way is a better way to go, Ethernet or the wireless uplink. In Mesh, we try to be cautious and break loops because we know how bad loops can be. So that means that sometimes we will disconnect traffic for a few seconds while we're trying to convert. Thanks for taking the time to view this training video.